Hello. Thank you for joining me today for Native Plants at Noon, Primrose Prairie at the Anita B. Gorman Conservation Discovery Center. We have a great show for you today. My name is Cydney Ross. I'm the Outdoor Education Manager for Deep Roots, and I just want to take a couple moments at the top to go over a couple housekeeping notes. First of all, I want to thank our sponsor, Missouri Department of Conservation, for connecting people to nature. And I also want to thank viewers like you. It brings me and my team a lot of joy to bring educational content about native plants to everyone's computers and in-person experiences. This webinar will be recorded. All resources will be available online, and I'll email you a link, including a PDF of resources following this event. Don't forget, drop your comments in the chat and put questions in the Q&A. And new this episode, you'll see that the names of the plants, the common names and the Latin names will appear on the screen, but I won't be putting them in the chat this time. I'd like to leave the chat open for conversation during our program today, but I promise I will email you the resource list, which includes every species discussed today. So keep an eye out for that email and be sure to continue the conversation in the chat during our program. Please visit Deep Roots online for more information about our upcoming events, webinars, native gardening resources, and more. Consider making a donation while you're there. And now I would like to introduce to the virtual screen today's guest speaker, Madison Twite. Madison is a young native plant advocate who focuses her studies on the prairies of North America. She is currently finishing the last year of her bachelor's degree at UMKC for environmental studies with a geographical information systems certificate. Madison grew up on the plains of Cass County, where her grandmother kept a garden of milkweeds and coneflowers. This sparked her love for native gardening. After getting a job with MDC, the Missouri Department of Conservation, at the Anita B. Gorman Conservation Discovery Center, Madison was inspired to pursue a career working with the restoration and conservation of native ecosystems. Madison currently works as part-time administrative assistant at the Discovery Center, where she stewards the native gardens and educates the public about the importance of native plants. After she graduates, Madison will pursue a graduate certificate in grassland management, which she will then use to work on habitat restoration of various prairie ecosystems. And of course, Madison's favorite native plant is prairie blazing star, Liatris pycnostachya, and her favorite native animal is the lesser prairie chicken and the bison. I love that, Madison. That's so great.
Thank you.
Madison, it's such a joy to have you on today's episode of Native Plants at Noon. So if folks have visited the Discovery Center this year, you may notice Madison and the landscape crew working out in the gardens there. And so Madison, as a young practitioner of native landscaping, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about some of the adventures you've had this year as it pertains to starting a native habitat garden. What has that experience been like for you?
Yeah, so at the very beginning of the year, actually like December last year, I got a little seed packet of native seeds and I double checked to make sure that they're all native. And I tried to winter sow them and that just failed horribly. None of them ever came up, but I'm still holding on to the jugs with the seeds because hopefully I'll be able to just spread them on the ground in a future garden I'm planning on building here at my house. But since that didn't work, we have another empty landscaping plot in our front yard that I started to plant, and it was a mix of plants we grew at the Discovery Center and plants that I bought from City Roots Nursery. So it's been really exciting to see the difference between the plants that we grew from seed, because these are perennial plants. So they don't just bloom in their first year and then die after their first year and only live for a year. They live for multiple years, sometimes 10, 20 years, depending on the plant. So it's been exciting to see the more established plants that I bought from the nursery. They're already flowering. Some of them aren't, so they're just a little younger.
That's so cool. You know, it's totally one of those things where you kind of have to do it to learn it, right? To figure it out. And there's so many different ways you can go about it successfully or even unsuccessfully, but that's part of the joy of gardening is learning how to do that. Yeah. Well, I think folks will enjoy what we have in store for them today. We will be talking about Primrose Prairie at the Anita B. Gorman Conservation Discovery Center. And before we start the film, I just want to let you all know, if you stick around for the Q&A at the end, we will have a pop quiz where you can get your very own native plant thank you cards by local artist Nancy Waugh. I love these. I send these out to friends, family, colleagues. I enjoy them. So stick around for the Q&A and be sure to pay attention so that you can get the correct answer to the pop quiz at the end. All right, Madison, thank you so much. We'll see you here in just a minute.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's Native Plants at Noon at the Anita B. Gorman Conservation Discovery Center. That's Madison Twite.
Hi.
And I'm Cydney Ross, and we're so excited today to show you everything that's been going on at Primrose Prairie. This is a garden that's near and dear to my heart. I planted it originally in 2021, so it's in its third full growing season. So yeah, we've got some cool things to look at and talk about the creation of the garden, the planning, the maintenance, and all that good stuff, right?
Yeah, I'm excited.
It's gonna be a good show. Right, so we're here at Primrose Prairie. This is the garden I designed back in 2020, and then we installed it in 21. So for me, this garden is inspired by Missouri prairie and Savannah species. And as you can see, I have a nice transition from full sun to part shade as it progresses to the west. Now, when I designed this garden, my goal was to pack everything in really tight. So most plants were planted on 12-inch centers. That way it helps with that weed competition as things were filling in, and really has that impact by year 3. So, that doesn't mean there's no maintenance involved in this garden. We still have some things that we take care of here throughout the season, but by planning properly, like picking plants that have similar sociability, like they all kind of grow in very similar ways in terms of prolificity, but so that kind of helps with it. So now by year 3, there's much less maintenance than there was originally, but you can see tons of pollinators are flying in. So carpenter bees, other native small bumblebees. We had a great spangled fritillary come in just a moment ago too. So you can see already the benefits of having a pollinator garden in your landscape. And if you're looking to create one that has a big statement like this, there are ways you can do it.
I was doing a training for all of the different natural habitats you can find across Missouri, and you mentioned that you were trying to recreate prairie and savanna habitats. Can somebody do that at home? Can they recreate natural habitats in their home garden?
That's a really good question, Madison. So I always recommend folks go out into nature to get inspiration for their home gardens. But creating a garden is very different than having a natural landscape, right? Whereas some of those well-protected areas have existed intact for thousands of years. Mm-hmm. These are human-made, so there's nothing natural about gardens, but that doesn't mean they don't have the wildlife benefit and impact to support our ecosystem. So some things that you can do at home is, first of all, observe your surroundings. Like, do you have mature trees? Do you have really dry, sunny, rocky areas? That kind of observation will help inform the type of plants you choose. But perhaps maybe more importantly, understanding what your goals are is number one place to start with garden design. So if you're looking to support pollinators, or in this case, I wanted this to support the white-lined sphinx moth, hence all the primrose coming through here. But getting clear on your goals and then observing your surroundings is really where you begin. And then from there, like you're saying, when you go and visit these natural areas, you can see what works in dry, rocky areas, like the rock pink we have here, or the Missouri evening primrose. Even the butterfly milkweed and pale purple coneflowers. These are all species that are typically found in our native prairie savannas and glades. And again, since this isn't a natural system, it's one that we have reconstructed, so to speak, you can kind of play around with that and get creative. So I definitely have a human-made glade here with, you can see kind of this pea gravel that we've incorporated into this section. And the rock pinks aren't blooming yet, but you can see the succulent and just how nicely it's filled out in this area.
You mentioned the pea gravel in this garden. Is rocks something, or rocks and pebbles something that somebody could use as mulch in their native garden?
Totally. So in this garden, we're using the pea gravel here as kind of a decorative mulch, but it also, it does help a little bit with drainage. We didn't amend the soil to have this beneath it, but as it as things shift over time, that definitely helps. But yeah, you can use pea gravel and rocks for mulch. That doesn't mean you're not going to have weeds come up. So in fact, actually you can see here, we have some crabgrass growing in this garden bed. And so this is a very common weed that I pull out of this garden. I just sometimes will come out here in the morning and pull out these little plants because again, though the mulch can help suppress weeds, it doesn't mean that it's going to stop them completely. Just like we have the desirable species in our garden, we allow them to spread, or at least I do. That's one of my big goals in my gardens usually, is for them to fill out. It still requires maintenance, right? So you still have to come out here and see what has volunteered in this area. Like here we even have a little baptisia. This is one of my favorite plants, but I'm not going to leave it here. So I will end up trying to dig this out. It is, actually I'll probably just pull it because I know I won't be able to dig it out. It has a pretty big taproot. So you can see that there. But it's all about understanding what your goals are and understanding what kind of maintenance you're willing to do, right? Okay, so another undesirable species, a great native plant, but not one I want in this garden, is passion vine. So this has persisted in the seed bank despite our pretty intense efforts of clearing this area before planting. So with this type of plant, it's a vining species. I will just pull it, pop it right out of the ground because it being a vine, it will wrap around things, but then it will produce these really stunning flowers, which then turn to fruit and go to seed. So again, it's knowing your goals. And yeah, I love this plant, but I don't want it growing in this garden. So things like that. I'm also editing out New England aster that has come in here. Pretty much anything that I didn't have in my original design. And within reason, right? Because sometimes you see something that volunteers itself into a landscape and you're like, okay, that's pretty cool. Maybe I'll leave that there. So I guess all that to say, gardens are dynamic. They change every season, and it's good to embrace the possibilities and also be clear on what your goals are. So, since this is a more formal garden, I like to make sure the plants don't get super tall. Now there are taller species that'll pop up in the fall, but there's some different methods that I've been trying here in the garden, like Chelsea chopping, some of the rigid goldenrod, or even the blue sage, just to encourage a shorter height and more blooms.
Okay, so sometimes native gardens can get a bad rap for looking weedy, or prairie plants can get a bad rap. How do you make a garden look good and presentable to neighbors or the public?
That's a really good question. So you're absolutely right. I think the number one reason native plants can look like real messy is mainly because people are choosing the wrong plants for the wrong place. You'll hear that phrase, right plant, right place, which really annoyed me when I first started getting into native plants, because I'm like, what does that even mean? Well, it means, again, going back to your goals, thinking like if you are doing a public facing garden, you may want to consider having short species all along the edges so that so you don't have tall plants that are overwhelming your viewer, right? The people who are coming by. So all of these species in the front are intentionally going to stay below 12 inches. And then also incorporating some finer textures like grasses. This is one of my favorites. This is eyelash grass. It looks like it has false eyelashes, and it's actually in bloom right now, so you can see all the cute little pollen coming off of it.
That's so cool.
It's so cute. But I like to incorporate grasses and sedges into my garden design because it also calls back to the American lawn, right? And so that kind of like with our current social norm of American landscapes, we're pushing into native habitat as becoming the norm, but until then sometimes it's good to have a callback to the lawn or have a transition to the lawn. And also these are native and they do support a lot of wildlife and they're really cute. So that's one thing, is like considering shorter plants along the edges. I like to have borders too. So you can see we have these bamboo hoops, and on the edges too we also have rocks lining the sides. So when early spring and in the winter time, you can see the intention, right? And I think that's really a big part, is showing the intention in the garden. And I know, I mean, you're like, Sid, my intention is to garden, and that's, you know, shouldn't that just speak for itself? Well, yes, it should, but I think there are ways that you can really create a garden that has these qualities that really just, that people will embrace, right? So another thing to consider is not just planting one species here, there, and the other. Make big swaths or clusters of the same species, because that shows, again, that impact, but also the intentionality of it. It reads more cohesive visually. And then in terms of wildlife, if you have similar species clustered, it makes it a lot easier for our wildlife to find them. It's like a big billboard saying, come and get some food. Nice. So all those reasons, but yeah, definitely being intentional. So clean edges, clean borders, designated pathways, maybe some decorative rocks. Those can all help create that intentionality.
Okay, so what was the history of this garden bed? What did it look like before you planted it?
Oh my gosh, okay. So actually right over here, you can kind of see what this space looks like, minus the sumac.
Yeah.
If you kind of look through here, before the original planting, it was just a really tall, informal prairie area that's full of crownbeard and cut plant and ragweed and some hedge parsley, you know, some things that we just like really let it go, because that's a fun thing to embrace too. It has its purpose, but we didn't want this whole area to be like that. So with our resources here at Missouri Department of Conservation, we were able to cut back this whole section, scrape the soil with a bobcat, bring in compost, drop in the rocks, and then plant over 400 plugs.
Wow.
Yeah. So that is a very extreme way of doing this, but it's not the only way to do it.
Yeah. So how would somebody like scrape their, I guess their blank slate, or if they have turf grass, if they don't have heavy machinery at home?
That's a very, very good question. And I've created gardens in many different ways. This is by far the easiest, straightforward way that I've had. But for a homeowner, what I would recommend are a few different options. If your turf is already sad and like patchy and lots of bare dirt, you could probably go ahead and start planting in it now. If you have really thick, healthy turf grass, you could consider sheet mulching, which is laying layers of cardboard with mulch or compost on top and planting into that. You could also solarize with plastic over the summer to heat up the plants and kill them back and then plant into it there. Or this way I'm doing right now in my own home garden, which is I'm actually cutting out little squares of turf, and then I'm using a like a hay fork to loosen the squares of turf, and then I'm flipping those upside down. And what that does is I'm keeping as much soil intact there as I can, but then I can use that discarded piece of turf to either smother other areas, which makes it easier later to take out. But then I'm just planting right into that bare soil and then putting mulch over it. So lots of ways you can do it. My biggest piece of advice though, like if this isn't your full-time job to do, break it up into sections. Create your entire plan first, have your goals in mind, your big picture in mind, but then really break it down into manageable chunks. That way you don't get emotionally or physically exhausted by doing this, because it's a big undertaking, right?
Yeah.
And there's no such thing as instant gratification. When I was considering like the design for this garden, I knew that I wouldn't be planning it just from one perspective. I knew this garden would be something that folks would walk around and engage with from many different angles. And that's something really important to consider too when you're creating your own garden. Is it up against a fence? If so, you can have the opportunity to put really tall species along the back, shorter in the front. If it's something that's in the round like this, then consider putting your tallest species right in the middle and having shorter on both sides. And then also, again, considering the sunlight. So we're standing in the shade right now underneath these big hackberries, and when I first started selecting species for this garden, I knew it could handle full sun species based on what was growing in there. But what I didn't realize was how much shade this tree would put off, especially in late summer. So it has been an interesting thing to navigate. And again, that's part of embracing the dynamicness of a garden, is seeing how those things shift over the season. So I want to jump into just some of the species that we have blooming right now. So up here you can see we have some really beautiful pale purple coneflower. This is Echinacea pallida. And I decided to plant 3 different species of coneflower in this garden. We also have some yellow coneflower that's kind of finishing up over here that you can see. Yeah, there we go. I love how dramatic those seed heads are. Mm-hmm. And the pollinators are still all over these too. So those are 2 of the 3 species. And then we have some Glade Coneflower down here as well. And the garden just smells so good. Like, you walk past it and it's just incredible. So there is Glade Coneflower over here. It's kind of hard to tell now with all the pale purple that's come in, but I believe this is one of the glades here. Yeah, and then in addition to that, we have butterfly milkweed, which if you have ever heard me talk about butterfly milkweed, I have very much a love-hate relationship with this plant, just because it's really a demure plant that doesn't want to be crowded out by anybody else. And now I have coneflower growing through it. So, you know, you have to make some decisions. So right now I'm just gonna let it be. I may consider transplanting the coneflower away from it this fall, once this is done blooming. But I've had many friends struggle to grow butterfly milkweed. There's many other milkweeds out there if you do struggle with this one. But something I've found is that broadcasting seed in place is actually a great way to grow this plant.
Cool. So did you plant this with all plugs or all seeds, or both?
Yeah, so I definitely planted this with plugs, but I let all the plants go to seed, so they reseed every year. And I would recommend, if you are starting a garden, I mean, doing it by plugs will give you the quicker gratification, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of the plants you buy at nurseries have been growing for 1 to 2, maybe 3 years, so they're really established already. Whereas if you grow things from seed, or if you just broadcast seed, then you can run into a lot of issues like, well, one, can you identify what those plants look like as seedlings? Can you compare, can you grow, can you tell the difference between those and undesirable plants? It gets really challenging. So it's not impossible to grow an area from seed, but it takes a lot longer. It's a really good method for large landscape, but with smaller landscape, especially really formal or public facing landscapes, I do recommend starting with plugs. But a little technique that I've been suggesting to my friends is plant your garden with plugs initially, and once you know the species that you want to have in that garden, that winter you can go in and broadcast the seeds of those plants over top of the area. So that way you're incorporating that plant into the seed bank, and in the next few years then it'll have a really great presence. So consider that as a nice hybrid option.
Awesome.
Okay, let's see what else is blooming. So I talked about the rock pink. I'll show that in bloom a little later. We've got 2 cuties right here, actually. We've got Rose verbena, and it's so fragrant. This is a great plant. I love how this and the hairy petunia is growing together, and they have this nice habit of kind of climbing up through other plants, which I think is really lovely. So those are here, and they're mingled in with the Missouri evening primrose, Echinacea macrocarpa. So you can really see how beautiful those are. It's also known as Missouri sundrops. And there's a cute little leaf hopper in here. I don't know if you can see that. It looks like a fruit roll up.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny. It does. It's so colorful.
It's really colorful.
I hope it's
so that's pretty cute. Yeah. And then again, like as I go through here, I'm seeing grasses that don't belong, and I just kind of go through and pull them out before they go to seed, right? One great way to prevent plants you don't want coming into this garden is making sure you get them out before they go to seed. So yeah, same with that.
I think it's so interesting that grasses flower. That's something I feel like a lot of people don't know.
I think it's a really cool thing. It still blows my mind, but yeah, grasses flower, and unlike our herbaceous perennials like the verbena and the petunias we saw, grasses, when they bloom, they don't rely on pollinators to complete that process. Instead, they're wind pollinated. So their pollen's a lot lighter. It can move in the wind better than the flowers of herbaceous perennials. So it's kind of cool.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, one of my favorite bees. I don't know if we can see it. It's a metallic green sweat bee. You see them in there?
Yes.
How cute they are.
Try and zoom in.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, it's so cute.
Oh my gosh. And then they flew away.
Yeah, that's okay. Okay, so yeah, let's get an up-close shot of this. Speaking of blooming grass.
Oh, there we go.
So you can really see the blooms on here. And this is eyelash grass, Bouteloua gracilis. There's also Bouteloua hirsuta. And you can tell the difference by the point on the end, and I'll show a little side-by-side comparison here in a bit.
Okay, so the little things hanging off the edge, that's the flower, right?
Yes, yeah,
okay.
Right here. So these are tiny little flowers full of pollen.
Wow.
These might already be done with pollen.
Yeah.
They're so cute though. And then once they're done flowering, they stay. You have this cute little just decorative bit on the end that sticks around.
Yeah.
And again, grasses also provide really good habitat for wildlife. So that's something to think about in addition to like aesthetics. You know, sense of place here in the Midwest. We're all about those grasses. But it's also beneficial for animals to get cover. I know a lot of our skipper butterflies use them as host plants, and yeah, they're just really cute too. So awesome. 10 out of 10 would recommend. Okay, so you can see as the sun is moving, this section will get a little more shade, but then the sun hits it again later in the day. So you may have also noticed I have some really cute decorative rocks in here. When I first planted this garden and I selected these rocks, I knew I wanted to create a planter. So I picked out dolomite limestone, that's this rock here, and I took some leftover prickly pear cactus and wild stonecrop and quite literally just kind of placed it all in there with some soil and pea gravel, and then put some rocks up against it. And surprisingly, it's worked really well. Very much like thrown together, but just I want to be honest and genuine about that, because I think a biggest thing in the garden is just to get started. That can be the most intimidating part, and once you have a little practice, it does get easier. But if you're feeling stuck, start somewhere, start small, and reach out to people who've done it before to see if they have suggestions to help you on your journey. Cool. Okay, so I also had some considerations about the species I selected because I wanted to make sure I had seasonal interest from spring to all the way through winter. I want it to look good year-round. So we had a lot of nice blooms coming up in the springtime, like Hoary Puccoon. We have our coneflower explosion, our rose verbenas, our hairy petunias. And then later this summer, this garden will also be filled with blazing stars. So kind of like the coneflowers, same with the blazing stars. I selected 3 species. Liatris pycnostachya, Liatris scariosa, and Liatris aspera. And those three will bloom one after the other or around the same time. So that is also a great way to extend the aesthetic of a garden, is considering the species you like, the visual qualities you like, and seeing are there multiple species that you could pair. So that was a recommendation from Missouri Wildflower Nursery, actually, Merv Wallace. I said, you know, if you love blazing star, consider planting more than one species, because it's like fireworks one after the other. And then in the fall, as we get to late summer, early fall, there will be the blue sage, salvia. It's a native salvia plant, and also rigid goldenrod. So these two species, I actually haven't decided if I want to keep them in this garden forever. So this is the first time I've worked with those two species, and they, like many of our late summer, fall plants, they have to get really tall so they can outcompete the plants that have grown up before them. So I know there's ways we can manage that with like Chelsea chopping, which is cutting them back early in the season to encourage shorter growth and more blooms. But I have done that to these plants, and I almost killed my showy goldenrod doing that. But that was my bad because I didn't water them after doing it, and we were in a drought. So learn from my mistakes. If you are going to cut plants back, a lot of them do respond well to that, but just make sure you water them really well and take care of them the next couple weeks, because it puts a lot of stress on them, you know. So yeah, so these will be blooming July, August, September, and then from there everything will start to turn gold and rust colored as we enter our winter beauty era. So again, I love this garden, and it has been just my joy to share it with you all. And I hope you've enjoyed today's presentation on Primrose Prairie. And special thanks to Madison Twite for joining us today and asking really great questions about this garden. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Cydney.
All right. Thank you all so much. I'm going to go ahead and welcome Madison back to the screen. Hey there.
Hi. I moved to the shade. It was getting a little warm.
Nice. It is hot in the greater KC area today, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to jump into the Q&A here. But first, let's see, I'm going to pull up my screen. We have some really great questions from you all. So if you have additional questions, please let us know in the Q&A, because we are going to dive into that here momentarily. And don't forget, at the end of our Q&A, we will have our pop quiz so that you can win your very own note card set by local artist Nancy Waugh, featuring some really cute native plants. Okay, so let's dive in here. So Madison and I are going to kind of go back and forth and answer these questions together. So let's see here. Okay. There's so many questions. So folks are asking about places to get native plants. So Madison, could you let folks know some of your favorite options of local native plant stores, and then we'll jump into some more maintenance.
Yeah, so this is my first year having my own native garden. So where I went was City Roots Nursery. I believe it's on like 39th or 31st. And so it's just in the city. But I like them because some other nurseries, like I was wanting to go to So Wild, but I think they're only open on the weekends. I'm not 100% sure of their exact hours, but they had just more available hours to stop in, a little bit more convenient for people who wanted to go on like a lunch break or after work or something like that. So I like City Roots a lot. My flowers from them have been doing great. Like I said, So Wild is another option. I'm trying to think. We for our Monarch Mania, we ordered online. I wish I could remember the name. I'll have to find out and let Cydney know so she can send that in the email, hopefully. But we ordered seeds from a company in St. Louis. And then there's also, of course, the Missouri Wildflower Nursery. You can order plants from them, so plugs, you can order seeds from them. And I think they're doing mixes now for people who aren't as picky about the design. You could just throw a mix of seeds out. So those are all some great options.
That's great. Thank you so much. We are so lucky here in the Midwest to have an abundance of native plant nurseries. But people love them so much. So we could always use more, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So I'm going to answer, there's several questions about the Chelsea chop. So I'm going to go ahead and answer that one. Just because it's really relevant right now. So the Chelsea chop, as we mentioned in the video, is when you cut back a plant that typically gets tall to encourage a shorter height and more blooms. And I like to call that mimicked herbivory as well. So my rule of thumb is generally between Memorial Day and Father's Day weekend. It's a good time to cut like certain species back. So it depends on when they put their when they have their blossoms or their buds. I don't like to Chelsea chop a plant when it already has flowers forming because it puts too much pressure on the plant and can really put it into shock of instead of encouraging it to grow in a different way. Also, someone asked if you can Chelsea chop your plants in the first year. I recommend you let them get established at least 1 year before you try cutting them back. Do you have any tips on that, Madison, that you'd like to add?
I think I saw a question that was like, can you Chelsea chop in the first year? And that would not be a good idea because like I said in the intro, whenever I was introducing myself, a lot of these plants are perennial plants. So they live for years and years. I don't know, the average is probably about 10 years for the longer end, maybe 20 years for some more hardy plants. But in the first year, they are really focusing on getting their root system established, getting their true leaves established, and working to become strong enough to live for all of those years. So a lot of them won't even flower in the first year, which is when you need to Chelsea chop them is after they began flowering because then they'll spread their seeds and be more prolific after that. But in the first year, it's not a great idea to Chelsea chop them. They won't even really be big enough to Chelsea chop.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, some folks may notice when they plant a new garden or put in a new plant, the first couple years they can get really tall and lanky and kind of awkward. You can't see my arms, but I'm doing like the wacky wavy inflatable two barb man movement. And I feel like that kind of calms down a little bit by year 3 or 4. Now, of course, it depends on other variables too, like soil, like how fertile your soil is. And I know a lot of our prairie species here in Kansas City are tend to get larger than they would in their natural communities on the prairie. But yeah, just being mindful about giving your plants a time to get their roots established, probably a good idea. Okay, let's see here. So another question. Okay. Janet says they have a 12 square foot garden with swamp, milkweed, purple coneflowers, and coreopsis, but see no pollinators. Madison, any ideas why that would be?
That is a really good question. So there could be a couple things that are going into it. I'm not like 100% the best about knowing all of the different pollinators that go to specific plants, but for the milkweed, they would like more butterflies and stuff would prefer to pollinate milkweed if I'm remembering right. But the other thing that makes me think of is like nighttime pollinators. There might be a lot of moths or maybe I'm trying to think. I don't think do flies pollinate at night? I'm not sure.
There sometimes I do see flies in my when I go mothing. I see flies
Okay.
and sometimes some little wasps at night too. But yeah. Yeah, that's maybe so I like your idea of like maybe we're just not seeing the ones that are out because we're out during the day, maybe they're there at night.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think
my
that
other thought would be just how old the garden is too. Maybe it's a newer garden and all of the different pollinators don't know that it's there yet.
yeah, I think that's valid. And if you think about like Doug Tallamy's Home Garden National Park and creating corridors for our wildlife, um, Janet, I'm curious what your neighborhood looks like because if it's all turf grass, you may be the oasis in a food desert. So it may just require a little more time, more plants. And then also keep an eye out and see if your neighbors are using things like Mosquito Joe, because unfortunately those are they don't focus just on mosquitoes. They are harmful to all of our pollinators and insects. But yeah, it's curious. So keep an eye out and hopefully you'll see some more pollinators here soon. Okay, so there's a couple questions that pertain to Primrose Prairie about some species that they're seeing in our video. So Val had asked about, or had mentioned they love how low the plants are, probably thinking about like Rose verbena and the Missouri Evening Primrose. And we did end up having goldenrods in there for fall blooms, but I did not incorporate asters. I had in my original, let's see if I can show it to you. My original design, this one here, has I think 15 species, and that was the first rendition. And now I think it's up to 25 species. So I started with a plan and then I plopped things in, admittedly. But that's why I think it's important to have a plan and then pivot once you get there. So I just couldn't figure out a way to incorporate asters among everything else that I already had going on in there. But I did want to make sure I had some fall pollinator species because that's really important towards the end of the season, especially for migrating pollinators like the monarchs. Okay, purple passion vine. So Madison, what's your experience with pulling passion vine? Have you been pulling much of that this year?
Yeah, so it really just depends on where the passion vine was previously. So I'm trying to think of like our other gardens that I work a lot in. Like in our parking lot at the Discovery Center, we don't have as much of a problem with the passion vine because it's in the middle of the parking lot. There's not a lot of places that the passion vine would have been previously. But then behind the Discovery Center, they are in just random places in the gardens. And especially in Primrose Prairie, that's where I find them the most, unfortunately. And because they're so beautiful, but it doesn't fit the garden. So I pull it the most in Primrose Prairie. I don't see it as much in the Deep Roots demonstration garden or in our bioswales or anything like that. So yeah.
Yeah, and the reason we find it in Primrose Prairie is because that giant structure in the center of the prairie is home to coral honeysuckle and passion vine, which again, I love it, but you definitely need a trellis for it. So Leslie, your mild invasion of passion vine, my recommendation is just to keep pulling it. Thankfully, it is easy to pull. Of course, weeds are or I shouldn't say called weed, that was rude, but plants are easier to edit after a rain, or if we're not getting rain, consider watering that area the night before and then go out there the following morning to make pulling plants a little easier. But thankfully passion vine is fairly easy to pull. Another plant that we were pulling in the garden, Christine is asking about the small white umbels that was shown in the before section of Primrose Prairie. That is hedge parsley, which is an invasive species, fairly easy to pull too. So again, I think my biggest piece of advice is if you can get out there when you see an undesirable species, that preferably before it flowers, but if you can't get to it by then, try to pull it before those flowers go to seed, because then you'll have a bigger problem later to deal with. And then another question about hackberry seedlings. You all noticed, probably could see some of the hackberry baby trees in that garden. So they're there, but I think it's interesting. My friend Stephen Van Ryan had asked me a question about this garden, thinking about the hackberries falling in there, and he thought, what would happen if you didn't pull the hackberry seedlings? How many of those do you think would actually survive? So I thought, I like this idea. I like this strategy. Who likes pulling trees? They're like really hard to do, hard to pull out. So I left them. And sure enough, most of those seedlings died out before they could get established. And I mean, there's still probably like, whenever I go in that garden, I could easily find 10, 15 seedlings, but compare it to like the 100 that had dropped initially. So again, I think that speaks to being strategic and considering what is going to happen in that garden a little later. But most importantly, just spend time in your garden and observing these things. So great question, Val. I think that's interesting. Madison Would you like to talk a little bit about watering gardens in terms of like when you planted your new garden, how often did you water it until it got established and things like that?
Yeah, so it's still in the first year. It hasn't even been a full year. I think I planted the first round of plants at the beginning of April and then a little bit more through April, and probably the last week of May is whenever I got all of my last plants in. So I still water it every once in a while just because the summer has been so hot and we are starting to get into drought season. So it's really important the first year to make sure that they are watered, that they get everything they need to help set them up for success. Um, but then in the gardens at the Discovery Center, we very rarely water, if at all. We really only water the new plants that we plant. So we transplanted some, oh, I forget the name. It's not mayapple, it's the one that kind of looks like mayapple. I'm just forgetting the name right
No,
now.
that's okay. That happens to me all the time.
Yeah, so we transplanted some of those from our front gardens to our wooded area in the back, and I've been trying to get some water on it every once in a while, but they're not doing so great because we don't have like a good hose system out there, anything like that. And then I think it was Tuesday we had our planting for the bioswales, and we are lucky enough to have sprinkler systems out there. So I'm not sure how often we're getting those watered, but they are going to be watered very consistently because it's such a hot summer. The heat is so intense on them, especially in the middle of the parking lot in the bioswales. So really, it's the first year that you need to worry about watering your plants. After that, they can be pretty drought tolerant in the second, third, and fourth year and for the rest of their life. But the first year is when you really want to focus on giving them extra love and care.
I agree, absolutely. And I just wanted to show folks an image of the planting of Primrose Prairie here on the left. And you can see as soon as they were planted, they were watered in, right? And generally, I like to say the first 2 weeks after initial planting, make sure you're watering them really well. That way, their roots are getting settled into the soil and less chance of shock. And also, just to kind of go on the idea of watering a garden, it's also, I like to mulch my plants right after I plant them. I think it helps retain that moisture a little bit and deter some weeds from germinating. Now, again, it does require maintenance still. You have to pull things, but I just mulch that first year. Then after that, I mean, you saw how full Primrose Prairie was. It didn't get mulched after that for initial mulching. Okay, so I'm gonna see, we might have time for one more question. And then we will jump into our pop quiz. Okay, so actually we can answer both of these real quick. So Maureen, we got Hoary Puccoon from Missouri Wildflower Nursery. And we will have that information in the resources that I'll email to you following this program today. And then Becky from Crawford County, Kansas, says they had a really wet spring, although dry now, but the showy goldenrod got a virus or some disease with brown spotty leaves, and it looks pretty rough. They don't want to spray, so they cut it down to the ground and cleaned up all the leaves. And they're asking, what do they do next? Do they need to do anything? New leaves are coming up and look okay so far. Okay, I know exactly what you're talking about, Becky, because that is what happened to my plant the last year or the year before when I tried to Chelsea chop it. So I believe it's susceptible to powdery mildew. Again, so that can happen when, again, very wet spring. It does impact the leaves. So I think by cutting it down, you probably did a great job, because since the goldenrods do respond well to the Chelsea chop, it should bounce back, and if not bloom this year, maybe by next year. So I think it just had to do with our weather conditions this year. But if you have any feedback on that, if you've had a similar instance with your rigid goldenrod getting those strange brown leaves, let us know in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. Okay, and now the moment we've all been waiting for. Thanks for sticking around for the end of our program of native plants at noon. So I would like the first person who can tell me what species of insect uses Missouri evening primrose as a larval host plant. I mentioned it in the program today, but if you could let me know which insect uses the Missouri Evening Primrose as their larval host plant in the chat will be the first person to win a set of note cards. And larval host plant being that the baby insect will eat the leaves in order to grow up. Okay, so we've got lots of answers in here. The first correct answer is Karen, the white striped sphinx moth, Karen Hedesheimer. I'm so sorry, I totally botched your last name, I'm sure. But Karen, if you don't mind sending us a private message, we will go ahead and get your address and send these note cards on to you. So thank you so much for tuning in today. I appreciate everybody's enthusiasm and interest in native habitat gardens. Madison, special thanks to you for all of your expertise and insight today. It is very much appreciated. And if folks, you're in the Kansas City area, consider joining Madison and I for a Discover Native Gardening session at the Anita B. Gorman Conservation Discovery Center. We are at these sessions 5 times a month, and we love to teach you all about seasonal native garden skills. And we also have a lot of fun. So consider joining us. You can scan the QR code in the bottom left corner with your camera, or keep an eye out for those resources that I'll be sending you following today's program. And as always, happy planting and have a great rest of your week.